I don't think that neurodiversity, I don't know if it resonates with me anymore either. Because I think about neuroexpansiveness being such an important factor in addressing problems and instituting change. And it seems socially, culturally, as an anthropologist, it seems to come down to people's natures, whether they are oriented toward fitting in and doing the same thing, which is great because they anchor certain behaviors that we need to count on. But in the world that we're dealing with now, I feel like that kind of the nature to really explore and expand, connect with others, feel other people's minds as your own is really critical. I think it's very primal, but I also think it's the wave of the future. And so I don't think everyone has that nature of expansiveness. I see how both sides are important, but I do think that they're different. So that's what I think today.
Yeah, I know. I share that. Although in the book I'm writing, I am using it. But I have two people, like I said, historical people who were diagnosed schizophrenic. And what's fascinating about them is that both of them had visions that were quite accurate. Dawn worked with me on this a little bit, but one of them, Dorothea Buck, in 1936, saw this. She was 19, she was German. This vision of Hitler having this war that she described using the word monstrous war, in which so many people would die. And it was fairly predictable at that moment that Hitler was aggressive. But the war that she saw was absolutely on a scale that nobody would have been able to predict. And she went to all the adults she knew and she said, you have to help me. You have to go to Berlin. You have to try to stop this war. And all of them told her that it was impossible, that it couldn't happen. And of course, we all know where that happened, where that went. And then later on, I think in the 50s, it was the 50s, she had a vision where she saw the world's climate being changed by human activity. And so again, she was going, to people and saying, she wrote to her sister and said, we have to do something about this. This is terrible. It's going to be so hard. And she was writing to people and saying, store food, think about what food you consume. And again, her sister called a mental health crisis group. I'm not sure what in Germany in the 50s that would have been, but they sent police to her apartment and took her back to the institution because how could you think humans could affect the climate, right? So to me, that's really fascinating. And I think that is at least neurodiversity in the sense of we use biodiversity. This is a bit on the, the far, maybe on the bell curve of how people think. So I am using it in that sense in my book because I can't think of anything that works better. But let me just talk for a few minutes about all of this. I think to get back to what I was saying, I think the universe itself is completely neuroexpansive. And one thing that really fascinates me about that is that so many great scientists reach a point with the universe where it's so strange and so challenging that they can't stand it. It's almost like their science becomes a bad relationship. That was true of Einstein and the quality we call quantum entanglement, which is basically quantum particles. These very tiny particles were all made of changing each other over vast distances. And another one was Darwin and the tail of the peacock. Darwin said that when he saw the tail of the peacock, it made him literally sick. And that was because there's nothing in evolution that really justifies that peacock tail being there, and yet there it is. And I think that is an example of that kind of neuroexpansiveness that the universe has, and that I think we all participate in. And I think maybe the more expansive you are, the more kind of authentically you participate in this weird neuroexpansive universe that we live in. I think to be a little more practical for a second, I'm going to read a little short piece from my book, A Mind Apart. And I do have to say, this is from, oh gosh, I wrote this sometime in the very early 2000s. So not necessarily language I would use now, but I think it does kind of address one of the things about a neuroexpansive or more neuro unusual mind and what it can contribute. So I'm just going to plunge in. And I'm looking at a book, so don't mind that my face is a little bit tilty. There are, I've discovered, doctors researching the role of mental illness in human evolution. Not doctors who investigate how to eradicate it, but doctors who look at how mental illnesses have contributed to human evolution and the flourishing of our species. One way of looking at this centers around memes or mental concepts. And this isn't memes. The word meme got kind of, taken by people who create little, images of Chris Christie or whoever and send them around the internet. It's not memes in that sense. Memes are what Richard Dawkins called the genes of culture. And different minds create different memes, and they're as necessary for the freshening of culture as new genetic combinations are vital to the freshening of the species. Bipolars, restless and unquiet, as one correspondent puts it, may have helped with the spread of human culture, migrating frequently and often into new territories. And that insight from these evolutionary scientists I was interviewing really cracks me up, because I totally see myself doing that. Like, it's 30 degrees below zero. No problem. Let's just go. And the doctor who tells me this, Antonio Petti of the University of Cagliari in Italy, was a founder of the Schizophrenia Project, which studied schizophrenia in terms of creativity. And I was corresponding with him. And like I said, this is the time with a very outlying way to think. It's become more mainstream. Evolution, our chance to adapt to new and unprecedented environments, depends on genetic variability. In this respect, there are no defective people, simply someone hosts genes that imply a higher risk of mood instability. This might be linked to adaptive potentials for the individuals or the group to which he or she belongs. We cannot foresee when and how these peculiar, and that's his word, characteristics of the individuals will save our species at the price of their own damnation sometimes. So a couple things are interesting to me about that. One is just this idea of memes. And memes, like I said, are these sort of ideas that get into a culture and, really spread. And you can look at things, like capitalism has a lot of memes. Greed is good. You can never be too rich or too thin. And these ideas that get into the culture and move, he describes them as the genes of culture, the base pairs, the sort of most basic ways that we start in explaining our world to ourselves. But they're also in a way kind of viral, because those greed is good sorts of things come along and they change things really fast. People really pick them up. And I think the idea that neurodiverse or neuroexpansive people are creating different genes, they're not going to be the ones saying greed is good. They're not going to be the ones saying you can never be too rich or too thin, is a really important part of this piece of why we're here. And I think there's the other part of it, which is that what I said earlier, if you simply apply the same thinking, which is what neurotypical groups tend to do, you are never going to move forward. Just in the same way that if you wake up in the morning and you have a novel problem, the cat is pooped on the floor, well, you've never kept cat poop off the floor. You've never cleaned cat poop off the floor. So you're just gonna leave it there because it's novel thinking that you clean up the cat poop. That's kind of a silly analogy, but only novel thinking can really solve problems. And that's very true for us as a culture. We have to think completely differently. We have to think about the climate in a completely different way. And I think right now that's a problem that we're really, really struggling with. And another writer I like, more recent than that book I was reading from, in the book, Richard Powers, says that the minds we diagnose as having a problem or a dysfunction are the only ones responding to the current moment in the most common sense way possible. So there you see somebody like Dorothea Buck seeing this war, or Paul Schreber, the other schizophrenic or diagnosed schizophrenic that I've been writing about, was brought to this institution that later the Nazis made into a gas chamber. It was a gas chamber. They were gassing the disabled during the lead up to the war and the start of the war. And when he got there, he said, "This reeks of corpses. This place is death." And again, he was able to see something that probably a really expansive mind could see, but nobody else was seeing it. I also want to mention something which I think lots of us kind of we're approaching in that really fascinating series of introductions. So there is this kind of way in which I think there's a different mind, neurodiverse, I'll use as a talking point, I guess, to move us past thinking about language, but I agree that it does have its problems. But we need that kind of thinking because it is going to be novel problem solving, right? Somebody is going to have to think really, really differently to solve the climate crisis, to help us with this kind of expansion of viruses. All of that is really important. We get into what I call a mental stranglehold of normality, and simply doing the same way, using the same means. And we need people who are going to think in the most novel way possible, right? But I think the other part of what we all experience, probably everybody here, or you see others experience at least, is the fact that the bandwidth of normal has become incredibly narrow. And there's a writer I love named Lisa Cosgrove. She's actually a psychologist and also a psychiatric critic. And one of the things she wrote that really resonated with me is that psychiatry has become more of a philosophy than a branch of medicine in a lot of ways, not, of course, 100%. There are so many different areas of psychiatry, but in this sort of general sense. And that it's a philosophy of the normal. And the narrower and narrower our bandwidth of normal has become. It has become so normal. So restricted. And if you think about people who are people that most of us encounter in school, admire, maybe think of as great thinkers, they did things that would now be considered, if this is your spouse, if this is your family member, if this is your whatever, get them assessed, right? I mean, William Blake, the poet, a friend once visited his house, and he and his wife were just sitting there naked. This is 1700s. And he said, "Oh, don't you see us? We're Adam and Eve." And they were just sitting there having, entertaining visitors, playing Adam and Eve. And the physicist Paul Dirac he had so many non-typical behaviors. He used to climb trees wearing a suit. He was obsessed with Cher, which is a little unusual for a physicist. That's what he was. He was the man who kind of identified the photon. He almost never spoke. And people, literally almost never spoke. And people appreciated this as a sign of just the kind of deep meditative mind he had. Darwin had this sand walk he used to walk in every day, and the pebbles would be organized in certain ways, and what pebbles he kicked. And we would see this as OCD behavior. So there's kind of, I think, a feedback loop of this philosophy of normal, this narrowing bandwidth of the normal, and the sort of threat to minds that operate differently. And I think far more minds would sort of have this more individual character, let's call it, if we weren't constantly kind of shrinking the normal. So that's, to me, both really important point. And I'm going to read a little bit from this book. Again, this is The Mind Apart. I became very obsessed with asking people how they think. And it all started with this dinner party, and I was really fascinated by the results. So, we're reading from the book now. We had a dinner party a few months ago, and afterwards, lying around being candid the way you do when you've both eaten and drunk too much, my friends and I started talking about how we thought. And this quest I went on wasn't about what you think, it was how you think, literally how you put a thought together. And I got very obsessed with it. First, my friend Rosina mentioned very idly the way you do. Oh, sorry, I read that already. Mentioned very idly if her daughter Beth left pieces of paper around the house scribbled with sequences of numbers. And her daughter was there, so we asked her what she was doing with that. And she said that when she's alone, she imagines these sequences of numbers and writes them down. And the sequences are thoughts. They're thoughts, like what'll I have for dinner? But it was done completely numerically. And then somehow we all started talking about things we do in our heads. And someone mentioned hearing music as colors. That's not unusual. Bruce, who is my spouse, talked about a system of government he used to have up and running in his head all the time with the president and elections and debates. And I was being a little protective of him there because he still does. He has an internal government, and his internal government has, like something bad happens, the government will collapse, they have debates. And this is basically how he functions. They set goals, and then if that government, instead of, submitting work and grading papers or whatever, if that government fails to do it, the government will collapse. It's really, really fascinating. I mean, I already knew that he did that, but it's interesting to hear him elaborate on it. So reading a little again, if he failed to do enough writing or things went wrong in some way, the government changed. So I guess it functioned more like the Italian government than the American one with its set terms. I used to feel vaguely guilty if we got into a big argument because generally the government would take the blame for it and topple. So that was an odd thing. And then I just started after this asking other people how they thought. And I thought, some people didn't really have an answer that you would find unusual. But some people, one person told me that she actually has an inner elevator, and the elevator stops at various floors, depending on what she wants to think about. So there's like a family floor and a work floor. And wow, I just really became struck by the richness of people's inner world, as well as this kind of sheepishness with which they would tell me, like, well, I know it's really strange, but when I think I have an elevator in my head, I was like, no, it's not strange. It's really cool. Like, let it go further. Let it go up farther. Let it go, find the basement, And I think that even these people who had this way of constructing thought that was quite different would feel so sort of, my husband's an exception to this. He's like the most neuroexpansive, right, Dawn? Yeah. All over. But people would just feel, it felt to me from the way they described it, like they would sort of try to control this. They would feel sheepish, and they would sort of try to control it and explain it to themselves in a way that was limiting. And I think that really speaks to that sort of neuroexpansiveness that we probably all have some access to, but it gets shut down. And so I wanted to have a few things that I wanted you to respond to some of this, to have some creative responses. And I know, Dawn, this is what you do, right? So everybody, I think, knows that you can respond with a poem. You can just write an answer if that feels good to you. You can move. You can do your math sequences. You can ride your elevator. Whatever to you is the creative response. You know, poetry, drawing is wonderful. But I want you to go ahead and I'll show you. Let's see, I can share a screen, right? Oh, can you enable screen sharing? I can read it out loud, but it'd probably be easier if you can look at it. Okay, there we are. So the first one I wanted to have you do, because I think, or have you not do, because it's not a job, but kind of meditate on, sort of take into yourself and make your own, and maybe in some creative way that will be exciting for you, is to, I'm going to get this out of here so you're not looking at two different things. There we go. Is to think about that really narrow bandwidth of the normal, and what are philosophies of the normal that you encounter and that you deal with in your own life, and what is the definition of normal that you felt in your life restricted by, and what are aspects of you that don't fit into that normal that you think make you who you are and that are really your strengths. You know, maybe that elevator is your strength. I know that Greta Thunberg feels like her being on the spectrum is her superpower. And I feel that way in a lot of ways about being bipolar, that, again, a term I use with air quotes, but that it is something that's very important to who I am. If you want to, you can you can mute and shut off your video. We're going to take like 15 minutes and then maybe share a little bit of what you've done.
Also, Suzanne,
Yeah.
one thing we figured out was that some people are verbal processors and like to talk while they're creating. So just to give you a heads up that some people might want to do that.
Yeah, that's totally fine. And you can, if you'd rather talk while you're muted or unmute, whatever feels good to you. But just kind of respond, let the elevator go and react to this. And I will bring everybody back. I can't get my video off, so just go ahead while I figure out what I'm doing. Okay, I'm going to ask everybody to kind of stop what you're doing, pencils or bodies or numbers down, and I'd like to talk about this a little bit and then leave you with kind of another thought about the neuroexpansive mind and its relationship to the world we live in. So anybody, yeah, Noah?
Okay, so I was writing mostly as an anthropologist, but also from a personal sense. Let's see if I can read my writing. I've been thinking a lot about how memes almost always used to be archetypes. Neuroexpansiveness with a group of people living in nature was a given, but there were shamans, people born with an extra layer of expansiveness, that were able to integrate expansive information for the group in ways that weren't wild leaps, but small adjustments or ideas within a primal framework that was understood by everyone. Now that isn't the case. Our shamanically expansive people have been pathologized and marginalized as, quote, normality becomes an imbalanced commodity that is traded on by people and systems we never meet. So there has arisen a great divide wherein both sides, quote unquote, see each other in extreme terms as the gulf widens. I think a more tribal approach to neuroexpansiveness would be healing for everyone, as those who have been truncated really against their will expand, led by input from those with additional expansive layers.
That's wonderful. I love that. That's the world we need. Please let it come. And this was kind of connected with my science research, which is very dear to my heart. And that is a movement among physicists. And this is not considered weird. It's not considered strange or I mean, it's not the mainstream, but nothing in science is ever entirely the mainstream in physics because it's just such a strange area of the sciences. But it's this idea that consciousness itself is one of the universe's fundamental forces. There's 4 fundamental forces, probably many of you know that, but gravity, electromagnetism, and the strong and weak nuclear forces, which keep atoms together. So the fundamental forces are the things that hold things together. They make the world stiff. And I'm really fascinated by the idea that one of these is consciousness. And some of the areas that this comes out of with thinking is the fact that there seems to be a change in things at the quantum level, you know, that level of really tiny electrons and photon particles, when they're observed. It seems as if the universe responds to observation. And that's one of those things that for some scientists is like the thing, like Darwin's peacock tail that makes them want to scream and throw things and create ideas like the multiverse, which is kind of corrects for some of the problems with that, because if there's infinite universes, you can explain anything away. Well, we're just in that one, you know, we're in 19C and that's where this happened. But I think it's really very beautiful and a very fascinating idea that there seems to be a sense in which our consciousness, as Richard Wheeler, the great physicist, put it, co-creates the universe, that the universe is participatory. And we're a part of it. And you could understand that as consciousness in the universe, if you wish. But on the fundamental level, it means that the universe can't function without us, without our minds. It's part of what, like I said, the fundamental forces keep things glued together. And I think that having this kind of wild diversity in consciousness, this expansiveness in consciousness, makes that sort of connection between the mind and the universe even more authentic, even more rich, and I think offers something that needs to exist. And so people who believe this, believe consciousness, partly it's grounded in things that are happening in our brains. We do have neurons and neurotransmitters, but that it exceeds that. This is kind of the substrate level of consciousness. And this is, you know, again, this is not a strange theory and it's not a woo-woo theory. It's based on actual research and measurements and equations and all those good things. And I actually interviewed one person. I always end up interviewing whoever agrees to talk to me, but he was one of the people who is on this scale who agreed to talk to me. His name is Giulio Tononi, and he's at the University of Wisconsin at Madison and has 2 endowed chairs, so not a lightweight at all. And he started measuring consciousness in a unit he called phi, because he wanted some way to kind of measure that consciousness that we have. And so I'm just going to read around just a little bit. Yeah, I only have a few minutes. He said to me, we've learned so well from science that this universe is immensely grand and we are a peripheral speck, a small species on a provincial planet, he told me, suddenly over Skype. But we exist so much more than that damn universe out there. And he is referring to this, he's referring to the hard problem, and the hard problem is the problem of consciousness, that there isn't any way to explain it, there isn't any way to justify it. even brain function, can't really capture it for complex reasons that I don't have time to go into, but have this inner narration, to have this sense of self, it's really not explainable. Phi is a very complex theory, he tells me, which he usually only presents in multi-day workshops, but I can grasp the basics. Integrated information theory and Phi are a way to deal with the hard problem. This marvelous job, as Tononi puts it, our brains can accomplish of producing consciousness. Not only can we not explain this, as I've said, but answers only get further away as our methods of measuring brain activity get drastically better. Most people and many neuroscientists believe consciousness is just lots of neurons and dendrites and axons working together. This theory does have problems, though, and the kind science doesn't like. The cerebellum has far more neurons than the cerebral cortex, for instance, and the gut has tens of millions of neurons too, and holds most of the brain's serotonin. Yet the cerebellum and the gut cannot think. And as I've said, we cannot find any action in the brain that explains consciousness, the way studying the heart explains how it pumps. The brain is a physical substrate of consciousness to Tononi, but it is not consciousness itself, which spreads beyond the brain and beyond us. The cortex represents trillions of Phi, but in his theory, many things besides us in the universe have Phi. Even a single neuron, Tononi puts it, would not be non-zero in Phi. I'm skipping ahead a little bit. He was just such a character. You live under a mountain, Tononi says, referring to Bellingham, Washington's Mount Baker. The mountain might make you feel small, but it is small, not you. It is non-Phi. So I disagree with him in that there are certain things that he does take consciousness away from. But I also just find it a really beautiful theory. And one of the things he believes is that artificial intelligence cannot maintain the universe in the way actual consciousness can. And in our conversation was ending, he said, you exist so much more than that damn universe out there. And I don't agree with that either. But it is this kind of theory that addresses the fact that consciousness is mysterious, that it changes the behavior of things as it observes them, that the universe does seem to have a participatory nature. And I think if we accept that, we have to accept that the wider, the more expansive the consciousnesses that are in existence, the more it feeds this kind of universal, as John Miller put it, feedback loop that we're all a part of and we're all participating in. The name of the book, please. Sorry, what was that? Which book?
People wanted to know your titles. Which,
oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, this is The Terrible Unlikelihood of Our Being Here. And the whole book is about this kind of unlikelihood of human existence. So The Terrible Unlikelihood of Our Being Here and A Mind Apart. So I had another project, which we didn't get to, but I'm going to share a screen again and share it with you because I think it's a really good one. And maybe you could take it with you. Maybe this will be a writing or a drawing or a singing or a moving thing that you do later. Oh, imagine your consciousness co-creating the world, an essential part of the participatory universe. We didn't do the scribble, but one of the things I have people do is just do a 1-minute scribble of their consciousness. What does it look like? What does it feel like? So start with that. If you want to stay one more moment, we could do that. Take your picture from the scribble or something else that's physical. The shapes and colors you're creating, or what, if you speak to the universe, you imagine speaking back. You can take this any way you like, but consider yourself as part of this universal interaction. The moon, the stars, the galaxies, the plants and trees you see looking out a window. Respond to this creatively. Maybe assume their bodies or their voices as they respond. And you may try to capture the interaction itself by writing, drawing, moving, calculating. So I'm going to stop share, but I'm going to put this in chat and give it to you as a kind of last little gifty.
Susanne, I would really love for you to either post those two prompts on our Facebook page.
Oh yeah, sure.
along with your book titles would be great. Also, everybody, we have the link to the weekly meetings is now up permanently on the Facebook page as well. What a brilliant conversation this was. I mean, I'm inspired to create all kinds of things.
Yeah.
My room is buzzing, but I can't thank you enough for everything you brought to
Yeah.
the table.
Absolutely. And I want to thank everybody that comments, the responses, the thinking that I heard here was very inspiring to me. So I hope you go out. I hope you interact with that universe. That get your phi out there. Get your phi on. I want a t-shirt. Get your phi on.
Yeah.
Trust your mind and get your phi on. Okay, bye everybody. It was great to meet you.